In researching environmental philosophy and preparing for the Greetings Earthling program, I ran across a book that at its foundation is a guide to civility when the climate crisis is very uncivil. The Season's Altar is the book. It's co-authored by Philip Kitcher and Evelyn Fox Keller. It's a book about how to have difficult conversations. It's a book about investing in long horizon consensus building. It's a book about how to be human when we disagree on something as fundamental as climate change and our survivability. It's a creative work filled with science and context and an appreciation for discourse. And that's something we might debate is in short supply when we're all shouting. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Kitcher to the program to discuss the evolution of philosophy and this effort to understand conflict amid the climate crisis. Before we get started, a special thank you to our critical and ongoing sponsors and private donors. As you know, Broto Art Climate Science is a program of the Cape Cod Center for Sustainability, which is a registered 501c3 charity. We have done this program online and for free. But that means we have to rely on our attendees to support us financially, especially for us tiny nonprofits in the COVID era when funding has evaporated. If you can help us, even with a small donation in support of this program and future art sci initiatives by Broto, please click the link in the pop-up. Now, on with our panel inspired by global citizenship. Thank you for watching. Welcome back to Broto's Greetings Earthling program, our examination of global citizenship and the human scale in the climate crisis. My name is Ian Edwards and I'm producer and host. It's a real privilege to have our next guest on the Broto Art Climate Science program. Esteemed philosopher Philip Kitcher is a professor at Columbia University in the Department of Philosophy, where he is appointed as the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy. In his career, Dr. Kitcher has been primarily interested in the philosophy of mathematics and the general philosophy of science, in particular biological research and its relationship to society and politics. He has, for our art audience, he has also developed a program of research in philosophical themes in literature and music. In 2002, Dr. Kitcher was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he was awarded the inaugural Prometheus Prize from the American Philosophical Association in 2006 in honor of his extended achievement in the philosophy of science. So we are very lucky to have him. He is also past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Philosophy and Science. He is also a former member of the U.S. Working Group on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the Human Genome Project. He's the author of 12 books, 19 books. Preludes to Pragmatism is another, Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism. And is this the most recent one?
It's the most recent one that's published. There are two coming out in the fall. Excellent.
Well, the Season's Altar is the subject, the Season's Altar, How to Save the Planet in 6 Acts, is the subject of today's conversation. It is co-authored by Dr. Evelyn Fox Keller. He is also a playwright. So an artist and a scientist all together. Welcome, Dr. Kitcher, to the program.
I don't think I can really advertise myself as a playwright. In the book, I do write some dialogues that might actually get read or performed in a very small way, but I can't count myself as a playwright. Long ago, when I was much younger than I am now, I did write a few plays when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, and they were performed by local groups. But I'm not a playwright.
Well, you know, in the Broto world, we have art and science. So you're sort of the walking embodiment of the Broto project in that, even if it's a little bit of playwright, it's great. So before we get to the book, I wanted to explore with you some of the broader ideas of philosophy and how it might pertain to climate and science. And in some of your research, you've talked about the reconstruction of philosophy. So for our general audience, what does that mean? Can you tell us?
So philosophy for centuries in the West was very important to Western culture. And one of the trends that I think has now been going on for over a century has been the detachment of philosophy from everyday culture, from its influence on people's thinking, from interactions with people. And like John Dewey before me, I believe that philosophy is profoundly relevant and it should constantly be attending to the problems of the age. And when I think about reconstructing philosophy, I think about doing fully rigorous, fully precise philosophy in ways that interact with the problems of the day and help to provide people with tools and concepts and methods for thinking about the issues that are of current concern. That's what I mean by reconstruction in philosophy, and I think it's what Dewey meant too.
So in that explanation, then we would find that philosophy still matters in a modern society.
I think philosophy matters profoundly. I think it's a real loss for contemporary society and for contemporary culture that there has sprung up this sort of wall between very, very intelligent and very brilliant people who talk to one another and the general public. I don't think that should have happened.
Is it pragmatic? I'm looking back at some of your other writings. What does it mean for philosophy to be pragmatic?
Well, I think of the classical American pragmatists, Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, as feeling in their time that many philosophical issues had become disjointed from the general culture and trying to bring it back. So there's a sense in which pragmatism has always been a movement within philosophy to try to reunite philosophy with the broader culture. But there's also this theme in pragmatism that we should try to make a difference to things. So there's a sense in which pragmatists are interested in progressive change, and they're interested in fostering progressive change. And so they look for ways in which defects in the culture of the age and defects in the thinking of the age can be exposed and problems recognized and then overcome. And that, I think, is the kind of what I think of as both the pragmatic and the pragmatist credo: overcome problems.
You have focused on the philosophy of science, and I think we can argue that science has been marginalized in the climate debate despite its critical importance to the issue. Perhaps that's changing. Why is science so scary to the mainstream population, and is there a remedy for that?
Well, that's a very good question. It seems to me that many people are dubious about the science of climate change, or have been dubious about the science of climate change, because they feel incredibly vulnerable and they view themselves as being further hurt, and their children as being further hurt by measures that we might have to take if we all fully recognize the costs of climate change. So, I mean, I see this as a movement that, as it were, whose denial comes out of fear and anxiety. I think because we've lived in an increasingly inegalitarian society, one in which ordinary people often feel that all the kinds of supports that they might have had in the past have been taken away from them, who look forward to the future and think of their children as lacking in opportunity. And then when they're told that they are going to have to change their way of life to deal with the problems of people in the world to come, the standards for the science go way up, and the fear of the science goes way up. And so I think that's what you're seeing. And it's a matter, this is in part what motivated Evelyn and me to write the book in the way we did. There's a sense in which what's needed is calm and slow working through these issues. Try to give people the assurances that their interests are going to be taken care of. Now, I think we're living at a more hopeful time in the United States right at the moment. because of that. I mean, I think some of the political initiatives we're seeing right now are designed to address those fears. But I think it has to be done through the restoration of community and a realization that we're not only citizens of a country, we're in a sense citizens of the world. And if this is to be a global project, as it must be, then we must all feel part of one community and committed to taking care of one another. I think these are the dimensions of the climate problem. They're ethical dimensions, they're economic dimensions, they're social dimensions, and political dimensions that intrude and prevent the science, warnings of the scientists from being heard. I mean, I am full of admiration for the great climate warriors, people like Jim Hansen, Steve Schneider, Michael Mann, and so forth. Great people who have given enormous amounts of time and energy to trying to get the message across. Why does it fall on deaf ears? I think because of these background anxieties, and we have to deal with those.
Just today, I was having a conversation that was enlightening in that the pursuit of happiness is what it seems that the society wants us to aspire to, when in actuality, people are just looking for safety and security, or that a society, an ancient society would have been about safety and security.
There are all sorts of things, as it were, tied up together in the blanket concept of happiness. I mean, it seems to me sad. I think that we have been fobbed off with a highly debased idea of happiness. It's what one might think of as consumer happiness. Oh, look at all the goodies you have. Look at all the toys you can buy. The market will drive the prices down as low as possible. And then having given people these extremely cheap forms of happiness, many people in the population then find that those forms of happiness are themselves beyond their reach. I can't afford a house, I can't afford a new car, I can't afford to educate my children, etc., etc., etc. I think we need a rethinking of what happiness means. And I think for many people, including the people who are most fearful about climate change, happiness is about family and community. It's about the ways in which they interact with other people, with friends, with loved ones, the ways in which they try to rear their children and hope for better lives for their children. Those are the really important things. And we've subordinated all of those things, I think, to this mad consumerism. I mean, Alvin Roth, a truly, truly great and interesting economist, gave a wonderful Nobel lecture a few years back in which he said, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the free market system, but before we set up markets, we should decide what we want them to do for us. And a world in which markets are designed to yield tawdry goods at the cheapest possible prices seems to me a very, very bad idea. And that's been the way in which society has been dominated, really, since the early 1980s. And I think what we're seeing today are the effects of that. I think it's time to get back to real happiness, to enduring happiness, to the kinds of things that people really deep down reflectively want, and back away from this silly stuff about, what can I consume as quickly as possible. The Greeks knew better. Then the people in the Middle Ages knew better. People in the Enlightenment knew better. People in the 19th century knew better. And people through most of the 20th century knew better. But we should recapture that.
I don't know if Shakespeare was a happy fellow, but the book, The Seasons Alter, is a reference to Shakespeare. I'm just wondering how he's inspirational here.
He's always inspirational for me. I mean, he's a wonderful writer and a wonderful thinker, actually. And so the title comes from a wonderful speech in Midsummer Night's Dream. Titania is speaking to Oberon. They are, of course, estranged from one another. And the consequence, the ways in which the seasons are altering are uncannily like some of the things that we see going on in the climate of today. And she says at the end, that it's their fault. All of these bad things come from their separation. And the speech, as I quote it, concludes, "We are their parents and original." And it's a wonderful speech. And it seemed to me the perfect title for a book about climate change. It's all our fault. We've done this to ourselves. Let's get on with mending things, including mending relationships, as I was just talking about in my answer to the previous question, so that it becomes possible for us to do something about this awful altering of the seasons, which will otherwise wreak devastation upon our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
The book, you use conversation as a way to convey the subtleties of climate science, conversations between a modern climate advocate and a modern climate skeptic, and you explore these big conversations in 6 questions like, is it real? So what can we do? What can be done? Who pays? It seems to me that modern discourse on climate inaction and other social ills seems steeped in doubt and extreme negation. Listening seems kind of passé in a world of talkers. Have we forgotten how to have a polite conversation? And
I think we've forgotten how to listen to one another. He says, butting in over your words. You see, I can't pretend to be innocent either. No, I think listening is terribly important. Evelyn said to me one day, and this was really a very important moment in our collaboration. She said, during the 1960s, there were during the Vietnam War, there were these conversations. There were moments when people came together across political divides and talked to one another about what was going on. That's what we need with respect to climate change, she said. And I think that's right. So in the dialogues, and I'm responsible for this. I mean, the ideas are completely co-thought, but I did write the dialogues. I chose to have 2 protagonists, both called Joe with an E, who's male, Joe without an E, who's female. Joe, the female Joe, is always the climate activist. The male Joe is a very nice, kindly climate denier. And they work through things together. Now, it's supposed to be a model for actual conversations about these issues. It's supposed to raise the issues in a way that responds to the concerns that fuel opposition to climate action. And the hope is that if people start talking together in these kinds of ways, it can snowball. Now, I think this is an alternative, and perhaps it's a good and necessary alternative to what people like Greta Thunberg do. I mean, which is much more active and is likely, I think, especially among young people, to issue in a faster growing movement. But I think if you're going to bring everybody along, you've got to have these more slow moving and these quieter conversations. And my one regret, now after some years after writing the book and publishing it, is that I don't think we went deep enough into the plight of those who feel left behind. We do have one of the dialogues in which people talk about their employment uncertainties. It's the 3rd chapter. But I think what we should have done is go even more deeply into the conditions of genuine anxiety and fear than we did. That's, if I were doing it again, I would make that a starker situation in which at least one pair of our protagonists are really worried about their future. They're really on the edge, and that seems to me the principal weakness of what we did. But we try to cover what we see as a range of 6 skeptical questions, ending up with the importance of getting, as it were, the whole world on board in a global project, which is perhaps the most difficult thing of all. It's a long and hard road that we have to travel, and we're traveling it at the moment in highly uncertain steps.
In your characters, you mentioned Joe and Joe, Joe with an E, Joe without an E, and in that sort of like we're not all that different, you and I, illusion. And you mentioned this, all of your female voices are defenders of climate. I'm just wondering if that was a choice, and whether gender as a subject of philosophy, how does it intersect with climate philosophy?
So it seemed to us that we had to go in one of two directions. We had to be consistent across the dialogues, that one gender was always associated with activism and one gender was associated with denial. We wanted to make them both, characters with some appeal, kindly characters, reasonable characters. And there's no great difference in certain respects between the two members of the pair in any one dialogue. But we felt that women are more likely to appreciate the kinds of considerations that move the climate activists, and men are more likely to resist those. I think that's just a speculation on our part. I don't think either of us would claim there's sociological evidence for it, but some sociologists could go out and see, right? I mean, the kinds of attitudes, there is a certain kind of caring that goes on with female Joe that comes through at crucial moments. And I think, it is, after all, women philosophers and women scholars who've talked about caring as an ethical stance. And we wanted to represent that.
I found that to be interesting, that the protagonist in this case is female, and at the time of the male may be done. I don't know if that's a philosophical question or a political question.
I hope not. I hope that, look, I have to be autobiographical here. I have lived through a half a century and more. And I've been married for nearly half a century. Well, my wife and I are about to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary this summer. And during that time, I've seen enormous changes in relations between the sexes. And I know that I have learned an enormous amount from women philosophers, from women scholars, and especially from the woman I'm married to, who is, in fact, another philosopher like me. And I don't think men are done. I think men can be educated. Men can be made more sensitive. And I'm always, to this day, I'm aware of the need for further progress in this regard. But in fact, it seems to me that we've started to break down, in some circles, some stereotypes, and it's been a good thing. And it's enriched the lives of men as well as it's enriched the lives of women. More of the same, say I.
Well, I imagine what fun it would be around the dinner table at your house with the conversations that go on.
Well, our children long ago made us stop talking about anything intellectual. There was a rule. They instituted the rule, and yeah.
Right. Pass the potatoes. Pass the Kant. Yes.
No. Talk about all sorts of things, but no philosophy.
Well, there you go. I noticed that in all of the conversations in the book, that the denialist doesn't get convinced, and maybe I've read that wrong. Was that a choice, or do they just walk away slightly amended?
The denialist doesn't get convinced, but does start to think. So each dialogue concludes with something along the lines of, well, you've surprised me with some of the things you've said. I'll have to think about it. Right. And that reflects something that we think is true in this kind of democratic, equal conversation. that it's not done in an instant. It's not done in one conversation. The effects have to be cumulative, and it takes time.
It does take time. Is that the most we can hope for in trying to make the case for climate? Is some appreciation of the other argument, or are we overlooking something?
Well, I actually want to go back to your more general project of enlisting the arts in climate. It seems to me that a lot of work, good artistic work, has been done in trying to bring home to people what a future might be like, and what various forms of future might be like, indeed. And that seems to me important. That can be harnessed to the kinds of active movements that young people participate in. I mentioned Greta Thunberg. And I think that's part of the progressive story. But I do also think that we're going to have to rebuild communities for all sorts of reasons, because we're politically torn apart, not only here, but in many other parts of the world as well. And in doing that, we're going to have to get back to a form of deliberative democracy. So I'm somebody who firmly believes in democracy, but the democracy in which I believe is one that is founded on exchanges in small groups of individuals, even between pairs of individuals. And I think that's that will be a necessary part of this, to stop what one might think of as the retarding forces that slow down these other movements. We've got to make, as it were, all political regimes able to get on board with asking for what they need of other nations and asking what they need from their own citizens to solve this problem. And for that to be done, it's going to take a combination of all these things: the dramatic artistic presentation of the future, the scientific evidence, the active movements, which are so striking among young people who recognize that this future is going to be theirs, and the slower community building dialogical efforts that Evelyn and I see as really needed to take the brakes off this forward movement. I think we're inching along. We need to go a lot faster, and we see ourselves as people who can, try to lighten the burden that this engine has to fight against. And it's a sort of multi-sided story. I just hope that we can make enough progress so that the generations who come after us really have an environment in which they can live somewhat in the same way we could live now, if we had our priorities straight, which takes me back to the other question about consumerism.
Well, and that is a struggle. Yes, I was wanting to explore, like, the Broto project. Just let me get back to my theme here. In this conference is about the human scale of living in a climate crisis, and a lot of the content has looked at extinction or existence or agency, and I see philosophy as having more and more importance. And a book like this, and I encourage all of our audience to go off and order this from your independent bookstore, is less preachy, less in your face, more conciliatory, perhaps, in defining some of the clashing issues around climate. And I applaud the effort. Have you had any feedback on how it's been regarded in the climate industry?
I think it doesn't really have an obvious niche in the climate industry. I think it's what has tended to happen is that various groups and various audiences have picked it up and really loved it. And it's always exciting to get a nice email from a person or a group of people who have latched onto it and who've really understood it and really understood what we're trying to do and why what we're trying to do might be significant. I have to say, though, that one of the things that seems to me, even with the best presentations of climate issues, to be wrong, is a misrepresentation of the decision problem. So, extinction. Are we going to go extinct? Are we not going to go extinct? Tipping points in the future. Are they going to happen or are they not going to happen? All of this is sort of bi-categorical thinking, and it's not good. I was profoundly moved early in the Democratic presidential debates by Jay Inslee's terrific performance at one of the early debates, where he laid out so much about the climate very succinctly and very well, but he made one incredible mistake that seems to me to be so often made when people talk about climate issues. If we do X, we'll be saved. If we don't do X, we'll be doomed. It's not like that. So after I'd finished this, I wrote a piece for the LA Review of Books in which I offered us a little story. So I'll tell you the story, and you can see whether you think it represents the decision problem a bit better. So imagine that you and your family go off to stay with some people who invite you to a very nice place. You're settling in, you have a lovely time there, and everything is going fine until one day they grab you and they lock you up and they say to you, you're going to have to play this game of Russian roulette with us. There's this gun with multiple chambers, and it has bullets of various levels of lethality. And there's this pack of cards, and we'll draw a card from the pack, and that will tell you where you're to apply the gun to yourself, and then we'll see what happens. And you say, oh, no, can't do this to me. This is a horrible thing to do. You invited me here and now you... And they say, well, tell you what, we'll give you a chance. There are these rules that you can follow over the next few weeks, until we decide to do this for the second and final time. And if you abide by these rules very well, then, the number of bullets in the chain, there will be more empty chambers, and the lethality of the bullets on average will be less, and there'll be more nice cards in the pack which say, just point the gun out of the window and pull the trigger. But the rules are going to be pretty hard to follow. Okay, that's the decision problem. What do you do? I think most of us would say under those circumstances, unless these rules are really, really, really going to be impossible to follow, I want to follow as many of them as possible. Not because that is going to give me, a totally happy future. It's going to raise the chances of a decent future. Right. So it's all a matter about probabilities. And notice, I didn't tell you what the probabilities or the chances were. Right. But the only thing you know is that they will go up if you obey the rules, and they'll go down if you don't. So that seems to me the character of our decision problem. And that's a very, very difficult problem to envisage in the abstract, which is why I made up this silly story. It is a silly story, but if you think yourself into that situation, it seems to me you can start to get some clarity on the way to think about climate change. We are being asked to make sacrifices in the present, no doubt about it. It is going to be rough. That's why it's so important to have justice so that the burdens are evenly shared. So it's not a matter of some people getting off scot-free and other people, having their lives really plunged into chaos. So I think if you start to think along these lines, you can begin to see how to get some sort of collective effort of the kind that we need in order to make as much progress as we can with respect to this. Not knowing at the end of it the extent to which people who come after us will be able to live in the kinds of environments we've enjoyed.
You know, I pull a story about smokers out in times like this, that a doctor tells you have 15 to 30% more chance of dying from lung cancer if you continue to smoke, or if you stop, you know, you'll do better. So the idea is that if you continue to smoke, you continue the risk. If you stop smoking, you hope for a benefit from the sacrifice.
Yeah.
We don't have a world where we want to give up smoking. And that seems to me a problem in the complexity of such a thing as climate change, that we are dependent on the very things that make climate change happen, but the benefits are not there to give up those cigars.
That's right. It's even worse in the climate case, because the doctor could tell you something. You've got a 15% chance or 30% chance, or whatever it is. In these cases, the probabilities are simply unknown. That's not because the probabilities of the individual things like sea level rise or drought in particular places are unknown. What's completely unknown is the way these things are going to interact with one another. The ways in which a drought and a migration and an agricultural shortage and a flood somewhere else and all of the other political demands on governments are going to combine together. And I mean, what we really should be frightened about are not just static things like the water going up at some nice, gradual, slow rate. What we should be worried about are the episodes of, acute crisis and the ways in which those crises will interact with one another, how one crisis will lead to another one. I mean, we're beginning to see the effects of this, I think, already in cases where drought and disruption of agriculture lead to patterns of migration. If we think we've got an immigration crisis now, we've only got to wait a decade or two.
I was wondering about the definition of human in the climate crisis, and whether we're the same people that your earlier philosophers were considering about existence and purpose. Are we the same as when Aristotle was doing his thing, or are we different animals?
Well, there are certain features of our lives that are remarkably different. I mean, Aristotle could think about the good life, which he thought about in a very deep and valuable way, but he thought about it for a tiny class of people, high-born male citizens of the Greek city-state. Fortunately, when we think about how to live, we don't just think about men and privileged white men. We think about all human beings, including human beings who may suffer all sorts of handicaps and disadvantages in their lives, some of them physical, some of them social. And so there is, I think, and there must be, a commitment to inclusiveness and to equality of treatment that would have been quite foreign to the ancient world. But they've latched onto something that, Aristotle, the Stoics, were very, very clear that, consumer goods, you really want a flashier car, a bigger house? Really? You think that's what your life is about? That's what's going to make you happy? Get real, man. You can hear the ancients saying that, and they're dead right about that. I mean, in a certain sense, the capitalism of the last 40 years, since the glorification of the alleged free market, has been an utter disaster for sort of deforming human conceptions of what happiness is. This goes back to the part of the conversation we had before. I don't think we're different people, but we are, in a certain sense, blind to things that people before us saw, and capable of seeing things that they didn't see.
Yeah, if justice is one of those things, I think we've got some work to do. But there you go.
Indeed.
A favorite exercise that we do at Broto is to envision a world already made sustainable and reverse engineering those steps to try and get there from here. You play with that a little bit in the book with a passage called Climate Day 2159. It's 138 years from today. What is the value of imagination when it comes to climate?
I think, this goes back to my admiration for the project as a whole. I think artists, and especially dramatists and filmmakers, can really bring these things to vivid attention. So one of the things that I like about Dewey's approach to philosophy and his approach to our understanding of values is a line that he has that actually it's not the moralists who really change the ways in which people value things. It's the poets, the novelists, the dramatists. And if he'd known about the cinema, he'd probably have said the filmmakers too. So I think it's very important to do that. On the other hand, I'm not sure of our ability to imagine a world made sustainable. Because, you can't really sort of project utopia, since that isn't going to be where we end up. We've already taken steps that will make that difficult. So you might, if I understand the thought experiment correctly, it should be an attempt to imagine the best sort of world we can reasonably expect to emerge from our current state of ludicrous inaction with respect to climate. And that itself, it might involve a very optimistic projection. We all start in now, but there's a sense in which you can't, as it were, go to the end and then look back and see what steps you need to take. To decide on the character of the end state, you've already got to make some assumptions about what goes on in the middle. So it seems to me tricky, intellectually tricky, to do what you're asking here.
If I were doing it, go ahead. Sorry, if you were doing,
if I were doing it, I wouldn't know the extent to which you could, as it were, start with a portion of the Earth's surface that was inhabitable. It's pretty clear that some parts of the world in which people currently live, in fairly large numbers, are not going to be habitable, whatever we do, in a few decades' time. So how much space do you start off with? And what population size do you start off with for that space? Those seem to me things that you can't really start thinking about the end state unless you've made those kinds of decisions. And I don't see how you make those kinds of decisions without making some assumptions about what goes on in the next few decades. That's what I meant by saying that there's an intellectual difficulty here in, as it were, jumping to the end and then trying to see how you get there. What you have to do is, I think, work backwards and forwards, and see if you can find a scenario that takes you to a reasonable end from where we are.
So within that with that in mind, maybe a last question. Is there such a thing as climate hope?
I think there is hope. I think that the hope is in the extreme motivation that I sense in younger people to do something about this. I think there's hope that, I mean, at this point in American political history, in that we are going to try to do something apparently about people who have been marginalized and left behind for far too long. We are going to do something about the workers. We are going to do something about the poor. Perhaps we're even going to try to improve education. That would be a nice thing to do. So I think there's hope, but I don't think we should. I don't think we should hide from ourselves the fact that the future that we hope for will be hard to achieve. So the hope has to go along with a certain kind of grit and determination. Otherwise, the hope will just simply be unfounded.
I want to alert our viewers that we're going to pop up in a second to answer questions live. So we'll be continuing this conversation, and perhaps we will get some questions from you, and we can add to this lively discourse conversation. So thank you, Dr. Kitcher. Please stay tuned, and we will answer your live questions soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian. It was a delight to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone, to the live portion. Yes, here we are. Thank you for hanging in there. We're here for the live portion. Dr. Kitcher is here for answering questions. As I do with a lot of our panels, Dr. Kitcher, I was wondering, it's been a few weeks since we produced that. I'm wondering if you have any reaction to what we were talking about, or what you've had thoughts since then.
Well, but basically, I don't think my views have changed very much since I talked to you last. But there was one thing I didn't mention, and that, it seems to me, is if this came up when you asked me the question about hope. I mean, I think another source of hope, and it's completely orthogonal to what I said in response to you, is that maybe there will be a technological fix. I was quite moved, and this happened, I think, about a year ago. The New York Times reported on a Swiss company that had actually done some fairly serious work and had some fairly serious results on sucking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And I was both encouraged and extremely irritated by the article, because the article was written from the perspective of, now, of course, in order to make this go ahead, we have to see whether it's sufficiently viable for investors to invest. And, and I wanted to sort of scream when I read this. I'm going to scream, if this kind of thing works, it'll be wonderful. So why not? Why don't all the nations of the world pour in money into ventures like this? This is such an important thing. Relative peanuts compared to many nations' global, overall budgets. And there's the Times talking about, whether this will survive the pressures of the competitive market. And you want to say, no, this is a symbol of what has. Is what has been wrong with us, an inability to think very seriously about public goods and to think very seriously about large-scale investments in things that will make all human beings much, much better off. Now, I have no idea whether the Swiss company will be able to scale up, but it's surely worth giving it a try. And I think there are actually, since then I've learned that there are other companies too that have got similar projects. And I think we should fund all of them, because that's a way of at least staving some of these things off and possibly even solving the problem entirely.
Some regular viewers will have heard this from me before, so apologies. But one of the issues that I struggle with is that I'm somebody who gets pitches from people who have climate ideas that can fix the world, but often at the end of it, they stop by saying, but I don't know how to pay for it. So it's always been a problem for me that before we can fix the climate, we have to make some ROI on the proposal, and that people have to get rich off of the idea of saving the world before we can save the world. Terrible mismatch. Anyway, I'm often reminded of that, and you've brought it up again. We have a question from Anna. What's the relationship between happiness and security and safety?
So I think there's an obvious relationship. I think if you're feeling terribly insecure and terribly unsafe, it's difficult to be happy. So in a certain sense, some level of security and some level of safety is a necessary condition for happiness. But I don't think happiness is reducible to security and safety. I think that I think real happiness, the kind of happiness that people like Aristotle were interested in, the kind of happiness that goes with, living well, seems to me to involve having a sense of your own life as being your life, tuned to you as an individual, and of yourself as doing things that, in whatever way you choose, have a positive impact on the lives of others. And that needn't be anything terribly grand at all. It comes most directly and most immediately for many people from the nurturing that they give and the aid they give within their families and local communities. And it also goes with the ways in which they, if they've got particular talents, they leave behind them some very, very small but significant changes that they have introduced to other people. A way of doing things, or perhaps a lesson that they've taught somebody about human relations, or possibly something that they've done that teaches somebody else or inspires somebody else, say with a love of nature or a love of gardening or something like that. These are all there's a wonderful, wonderful line in Wordsworth's poem about Tintern Abbey, where he talks about our little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. And I think that's actually terribly important in a happy life, to look back and feel that your life actually had some of those too. You did some things that were little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. And so I think beyond, of course, in order to do these kinds of things, you do need security and safety, at least at some level. But it's actually, I think, the impact on others and feeling that that's something that you do and it expresses you and your way of being. I don't know whether that's a good answer for you, Anna, but I hope it helps.
And it reminds me again that, like Aristotle working with privileged white men back when that was his time, we are also in a bubble talking in an echo chamber of people who are like-minded. It's one of the big challenges that I sense for our production and our movement is that we are talking to each other and a little bit inside a bubble, protected from some of those other ideas. Certainly here in Massachusetts, where I live, I'm living in a bubble.
A couple of questions are popping up on the.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to them.
Yes.
I'm going to respond to Mark's question first, because it's an easy question to answer because it's short. So quite a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is likely to become uninhabitable, or at least not habitable in ways that enable people to go and work outside for the amount of time they need to feed themselves. Parts of Asia also. And of course, there are the Pacific Islands that are in danger of being just sort of periodically flooded. But principally, I would say parts of Asia and parts of Africa, and probably the population of those regions is maybe 1 billion people, maybe a little bit less, but of that order of magnitude. And then Matulebi has a question: why is it so hard for people to take climate action despite understanding the issue of climate change? I think I tried to give a general answer to that, but let me try to be more specific in response to the question. So think of somebody who is, shall we say, a coal miner or a dependent of a coal miner. What's going to happen to my life, that person says, if we start investing in renewable energy? I'll be out of a job, or whoever it is who supports me will be out of a job, and I'm not going to get protected. There'll be no other kind of work I can do. And one of the things I think that has been so important about the Green New Deal is that it has taken that issue quite seriously and is an attempt to respond to it. Of course, one of the great sort of pieces of social science around this whole issue is that actually response to climate, whether you're an activist or somebody who wants to resist activism, kind of denier, doesn't depend so much on your level of scientific education. What it principally depends on is your party affiliation. That's in the United States. This is work done by Dan Kahan and his group at Yale, and it's, I think, very good, and it's very important work. So I think the problem is twofold. There's this sense of real vulnerability, but the sense of real vulnerability goes along with a sense that there are certain kinds of people out there with whom you identify politically, who share your sorts of problems and who are worried about your sorts of things. And that makes the resistance, I think, more acceptable, that you form, as it were, part of a group. And these people are exaggerating. They're going to force vast social changes on society that society doesn't want. It's all an excuse for some kind of radical, progressive, or liberal agenda, etc., etc. So there's a kind of bundle, I think, that makes it hard for people to take climate action and support climate action and take it seriously.
Looking at the time, we have about 2 minutes in this official 1-hour session. I'm looking for another question, or I can ask one. Something I hold dear is the idea of a voice of dissent, a constructive dissent, and I feel like that's lost in the world, that we can't disagree without yelling at each other. Is there a way for us to resurrect dissent in a meaningful, constructive way?
I hope so. I agree with you. But I think what is really needed is what I think of as the ability to listen, to come to somebody and say, look, I understand that your perspective is quite different from mine. And I want to try to understand where you're coming from, and I want to respond to it in a way that will satisfy both of us. The core of democracy, I think, is actually in that kind of negotiation, not in voting the other people down. Think of a family. Families don't operate by, everybody says what they want, and then we can't tally up the votes. What they try to do is reach some kind of joint plan together, something that everybody in the family can live with. And it's unsatisfactory if they can't reach that. It's disappointing for everybody.
We're going to wrap it up there for our viewers. We can continue this this discussion in a post-panel meeting room, which we can go to right away. I want to say thank you to Dr. Kitcher and to our attendees, and such a stimulating conversation. It's a lost art.